Welcome to our webinar, during which we want to highlight some of the key points arising from HMRC's consultation with regard to IPT and set our current thoughts on what this might entail for the sector. By way of introduction, my name is John Forth. I head up our Financial Services Indirect Tax Practice, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Justine McInnes. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand you now over to Justine, who's going to briefly outline the agenda, just covering some of the issues that we're going to cover.
Thank you, John. Okay, so we thought we'd go through 4 areas. First of all, just a few thoughts on the IPT consultation. Then a quick reminder of who actually bears the IPT cost and therefore who is ultimately going to be affected by any changes in the IPT consultation. Then do a bit of crystal ball gazing to think about what potential outcomes could arise from the consultation, and also what these outcomes mean in practice for the industry. So, I have to say we were generally disappointed by the consultation, as we're not sure what it's actually going to achieve. It appears to reflect an ingrained view of HMRC that there is a great deal of avoidance and evasion within IPT, and that's simply not our experience. Really, the tone of it also suggests that HMRC have already reached a view as to what they are wanting to achieve and changes they want to make, and are now using the consultation to gain support for these changes. So, just a quick reminder of who bears the IPT cost. We've set out a couple of examples here. First for a broker and the second for an underwriter. And it's worth looking through these and noting that where the IPT rate goes up, the broker commission will go down, and likewise for the underwriter, the amount that they retain will go down when the IPT rate goes up. And this really falls to the very tight margins which we see in the insurance sector, particularly for retail contracts, and the fact that really there's a fixed amount that the insured will accept in terms of premium amount, and therefore, no matter how much IPT is due, it's not really possible to pass that much, if any, onto the insured. And this applies even for net-rated policies, because of the limit on maximum gross premium, the broker's responsibility for putting the underwriter in funds with the IPT amount, which the underwriter will have to account for. So any IPT changes which result from the IPT consultation will impact directly on brokers and underwriters, as well possibly to a certain extent to the insured. I'll now hand you over to John, who will talk about the unbundling legislation changes we foresee there.
Thanks, Justine. Under the unbundling legislation, provided certain conditions are met, administration services are outside the scope of IPT, and the admin fee will typically also be exempt from VAT. Now, separately identifying the admin fee can give rise to IPT savings of up to 30% for the taxpayer, and this saving effectively represents the cost of providing the admin service. That's what the cost is, and that's the element of the premium which is not subject to IPT. However, the tone of the IPT consultation suggests that HMRC believes that the unbundling legislation is being used for tax avoidance purposes. Now, our view is that this is not being used for avoidance purposes, and to the extent that IPT is being underpaid at all, this is a result from a genuine misunderstanding, primarily around the requirement to have a separate contract in place. Now, currently, in order for the admin service to be outside the scope of IPT, there's a number of criteria which have to be satisfied. Firstly, the administration services must be subject to a separate contract between the insured and the service provider, and the fees for the services must be identified in writing and disclosed to the insured. Now, if the services relate to a retail policy, and by retail policy we mean to a consumer rather than a business, then the premium for the policy must also be either risk assessed, or the services must be such that they could be provided separately to the policy, or the amount payable and or the terms of the separate contract must be negotiable, or the insured must not be obliged to enter the contract for services. So at least one of these criteria needs to be met in order for a retail policy to be capable of having an unbundled administration fee. Now, if changes to the unbundling legislation are made, then there could be a number of implications. First one we've set out there is the possibility of having to unwind the unbundling structures which have been implemented. Now, administratively, this could be quite difficult, it's likely to be both time-consuming and a fairly costly exercise to undertake. If the unbundling legislation is amended, then going forward, you'll need to ensure that accounting systems can cope with the new requirement of adding IPT to administration fees. There may be possibly changes to reporting requirements. It's unclear at this stage what that might entail, but clearly there could be an additional burden in terms of extra reporting to do. And finally, and not least, the commercial impact of having to deal with additional IPT costs. Now, that's not to say that it wouldn't necessarily be applied. There are certain things which can be done to mitigate the additional IPT by, for example, implementing service contracts or contracts of guarantee. But on the face of it, clearly it's going to result in a potentially significant additional IPT cost for the sector. I'm going to hand you back now to Justine, who's just going to talk upon some issues in relation to brokers.
Thank you, John. Okay, so another aspect that we foresee being addressed by the IPT consultation is that liability for IPT may well be extended to brokers. So at the moment, obviously, it's the underwriter who is the taxpayer, and it is the broker who is responsible for putting the underwriter in funds to pay the IPT. However, there is a possibility that where HMRC see a high risk of avoidance or evasion, they may well also make the broker liable, and that's particularly, it seems, for overseas underwriters who are writing risks in the UK and for whatever reason may not have registered. So, as we're aware, the broker already has liability for underpaid IPT under the terms of the broker agreement, so this would be an extra layer for that. That said, though, it will give brokers the opportunities to make sure that their houses are in order and that they're calculating the IPT correctly. And so it is something that we think may actually be advantageous to a certain extent. I'll now hand back to John.
Thanks, Justine. Okay, well, what can you do to prepare for any changes? Well, there's some suggestions here. In relation to systems, check to ensure that you can capture any additional IPT which could become due following the decision made by HMRC post the consultation. In relation to IPT costs, review current transaction and document flow to determine whether any IPT reduction strategies are available. Ensure that bordereau calculations and checks are robust. And ensure that terms of broker agreements minimise broker liability as far as is possible. That brings the webinar to a close. Now we wait until hear from HMRC in terms of the outcome from the consultation. As soon as we're aware of that, of course, we'll let you all know. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening today. On the final slide there, we've got some contact details. So should you have any queries in relation to IPT, please don't hesitate to contact either myself, Justine, or our colleague, Mervyn. Okay, thank you very much for your time today.